pointed out here, whether by media, by Chef Gut and colleagues in and around Brampton, Brown as well, are issues that we have addressed over the course of the last 18 months. So that's a very short period of time to make a big ship like immigration move. Big ships take time to move, and they have, and that is thanks to the work that has been done raising awareness and making sure our government reacts to where we see things maybe not being where they should be. But good heavens, we're in a much better place than we were even 18 months ago, and especially in the context of the last 3 months. I think we can also be really happy to be in Canada, but also be very proud to be Canadian. If you hear what the Prime Minister has been saying, what even just regular Canadians have been coming up to me saying how proud they are of being Canadian, and that we need to keep fighting for Canada. And there's a shift in the population that we're seeing with some of the challenges that we see to the south of us, and that's something that we have to keep fighting for you, because it's not us fighting for our jobs, it's us fighting.
One thing is clear, like with everyone's question, that there was a mess and there is a mess in the immigration, and that's why government is on the path to fix that issue. As everybody mentioned, Mr. Sani mentioned very relevant points. As per the report, National Post reports that 20,000 plus Indian international students, they failed to register in their colleges after arriving in Canada. The Canadians raised concern of fraud. What happened to them? Whether they crossed over to US or are they still here in Canada? Because many of the colleges, their application of the asylum seeker is very high. International student who is here for studies is applying for a threat on him in his home country is very shocking. Then same-sex marriages applications are very high in males and females. Those trends are going on. So these are the shocking trends. We have become a country of laugh by the world that these things happening here. Our reputation has gone down as a Canada. So who takes that responsibility of this mess, and where are those 20,000 plus students?
It's collective responsibility. That number that you're quoting is a bit of a trailing indicator, but it is one of the reasons why we made a number of these policy adjustments and clamped down on the system in general, and ready to do more. But I've done 2 waves of clampdowns in the last little while. We've seen results where it has prevented a large number of instances of fraud. Verification letters are very important. There's a lot of responsibility, frankly, on the universities that are welcoming people to take responsibility for these people that are paying exorbitant fees just to show up in Canada. It doesn't make sense that if you're paying that much money, you suddenly turn your back when the person doesn't show up in your classroom, right? And that is Canadian state doesn't follow everyone's comings and goings. That's the reality. I don't track you. Just the conspiracy theorists think we track you guys. No, we don't, and that's the reality. I'm not being cavalier about this, but the reality is that they did get a visa. They were expected to go study, and for one reason or another, there's a large number of people that didn't do so. They may have abused of the ability to go work in whether it's underground or legitimately, and that's something I think we need to follow a little more closely. It isn't just the federal government, it's provincial governments, it's institutions that have perhaps even entertained false hope. People have paid a lot of money just to get in here, and then if they disappear, it's not right. You're expected to study, and if you're not, you shouldn't stay here. That's why some of the clampdown has been so important, to make sure that we are actually getting in legitimate students into this country, and I think we've seen that largely. I'm prepared to do more if need be, if I see this trend continuing. My sense is that it has dropped. Is it perfect? That I think remains to be seen. It's very difficult right now for even some of the top institutions that weren't doing all that much wrong. It's more difficult to recruit. I think we need to make sure that the Canadian brand does focus on excellence, on quality, and less quantity. And clearly, I'm ready to do more, but it'll require a rebranding exercise, but also a rework with universities and colleges and provinces. Important to make that responsibility, to make sure that we are following people more closely in their academic journey. Because again, we're talking about a younger set of the population, our kids, that we need to follow closely and make sure that they're being properly accompanied when they come into Canada legitimately, including I mean, and I'll say another thing about the asylum-seeking numbers, including during the academic journey, but also after, if they are working to make sure it's actually matching with the education they got and the promise that they were implicitly given. On the asylum-seeking numbers with students, the trend, I'd be foolish to say we didn't expect the trend to increase given the volumes. We see some of the institutions that are closing some of their programs down now had the higher number of asylum seekers. But let's bear in mind that, again, if you follow the money, those institutions took the money. Now the asylum-seeking process is one that it weighs financially on the backs of the government of Canada. I'm prepared to do more with illegitimate claims. It doesn't make sense that if you come here, spend a year, and you didn't have the conditions in your country to cause you to be an asylum seeker on day one, that a year later or 2 years later, and unless there was something that happened in your home country or some individual circumstance that made you fear for your life, which is often rare, that you should be entitled to a process that would drag on and on. So I'm prepared. Parliament is prorogued currently. I am prepared to introduce a bill in Parliament or even take other measures, whether it's by regulation or others, to make sure that those cases in particular are dealt with in a more efficient fashion.
President Trump, whatever he is doing for US for the deportation is good for America. They are handcuffed, they are sent back to their home countries, and that is good for their country. Indian External Affairs Ministry said that they are going to accept any illegal person across the globe. They are ready to accept back. Here in Canada, we have many undocumented, out of status, illegal, and moreover that those who are repeatedly criminals, means 75 charges on them without status. Still they have not been deported. Our Milton jail is full of 80+% of South Asian people, including Indians. Why they are into jails for so long time? Why no action being taken? Because that is a loss to the taxpayers, and immigration gets a bad name on that.
I don't disagree with you that these cases, they need to be dealt with fairly but swiftly. I don't have the facts about the Milton jail, and I wouldn't speculate on it. But certainly, given what we've done last year, those are important numbers. But it is important for people to get an expedited process. I won't comment on what the U.S. is doing. We're following it closely. Some of it looks the way it looks to all of you, but I mean, we need to take care of our business.
Can I add into that
Yes.
one? Look, our judicial system, that those cases are under provincial jurisdiction. It's up to province and the courts, they have to decide their cases. In last 3 years, 54% of the cases have not been addressed or either withdrawn or is dismissed. The people who are in jail, it's a provincial responsibility. We cannot deport them unless case decide their case. If there's charges, they have charges. That's what the Constitution we have. So I think it's the people who are there. Once their case has been finalized, then I think it's we are able to send them back. But Minister has taken very swift action, and he's. These are the things already under consideration. That person was here, came for study, but never gone to school, or there's no consistency or criminal activity. Obviously, it will be dealt with accordingly.
In housing, it's a problem that's been created over the last 3 decades. You can't solve it over the course of a few years. That is just the reality. The federal government's been out of federal housing for about 30 years. It's only Justin Trudeau and the programs that we put into place that have started to address the supply of housing and the federal government's involvement in this. It's probably a failure across the system to deal with that, and it's a bit of a problem that's been in the making for, regardless of the government that's been in place for about 3 decades. I think regardless of these sort of, I'm not saying I don't take them seriously by calling them blips, but the market goes up and the market goes down. I think the need for sustained federal investment will be important so that we don't cause this in another 10 years when people suddenly say, well, where was the federal government? It is a provincial responsibility. Doesn't mean the federal government shouldn't be investing it. A government like ours is active in making sure that we're in the business of supply. With mortgage rates coming down, with interest rates coming down, you see that attractiveness and the ability of people to be able to buy houses going up a bit.
Don't know yet.
There's a lag, you don't know yet.
Yeah.
But you also see the price line of houses kind of stabilized as a result, or even going up. So we do have to adjust to that. I think in my role, the most important thing and decision that I took is what economists look a little more intimately than more people expect, which is what the population progression is. And in the last levels plan, that is much more complete than any other levels plan that we've ever provided. One, because we fold in temporary residents into the numbers, was the stabilization of the population growth, and even a population drop in year 3, if our plan does bear out through the last 3 years. So that'll be very important for me. People making, it'll reduce the number of housing starts that we need to generate. It's more or less confirmed by the parliamentary budget officer, probably, in fact, as close as we've ever gotten when it comes to that type of scrutiny. So that's a positive sign, but it doesn't mean that it absolves us from our need to continually invest. And I think I would expect the next leader of the Liberal Party to make those commitments as well, because I think we've learned our lessons from getting out of the business for about 30 years.
Okay.
To do biometrics, which is checked with our international partners. This is not something we did 10 years ago. It's been phased in over the last few years. So that's very important, and we check that with our security partners internationally. We also have a progressive method of assessing candidacies, and there are security checks that are done. That has gotten confused in some public narratives that have been spread in and around the use of police certificates. You can understand how a country that is not necessarily the most reliable security partner would not necessarily be the most reliable country to be providing police certificates. So that has gotten confused in some of the public narrative, but people should not think that there are not security checks done on every single student that comes to the country. But there are security screens, including biometrics, which is something that was not done 10 years ago. And are we safer now than we were 10 years ago when it comes to the way we screen people coming to the country? Look, you won't see Canada doing what the Trump administration is doing, and nor will we be adopting that rhetoric with respect to immigrants generally. It doesn't mean that we aren't firm when it comes to people that are here that are not authorized to be here. Canada is a rule of law. People that are here are entitled to adjudication of their case, but if you are here in an irregular fashion and don't have a right to stay, you need to leave or you will be removed. There's plenty of people whose visas end that do leave voluntarily. To the extent they take the decision not to respect the law, Canada will remove them. Last year, as an example, we had the largest number of removals in recent history. It's not something that we broadcast broadly, but it does take time. It takes time and it takes resources. So making sure that we have a system where when we welcome people, they understand their rights, they understand their obligations that they need to leave. Just as a tourist would be expected to leave on expiration of their visa, an international student that does not have the right to be here is expected to leave. People are here, for example, on a student visa to study. They're not here with a guarantee to become permanent residents or a guarantee to become Canadian. They need to understand that before they come to the country. In fact, they undertake to do so in the documents that they sign in order to get their visas. I'm not naive. I do know that people try to see hope and think because Canada is the best country in the world, they may have a hope to stay. In some circumstances, because our education system is one of the best in the world, we would expect some people to stay because we are getting some very, very bright people as part of the workforce, already trained, starting their integration, but it can't be for everyone. What I saw with the volume that we were seeing in 2023 was just unsustainable numbers to integrate people into our permanent residency level, so we had to adjust accordingly. And indeed, those visas are down about 45% this year, which is very important because there were some actors that were profiting from the ecosystem that was created, making lots of money. And frankly, no one was really paying much attention to what happened once people graduated. If you get a certificate in automotive engineering or a certificate in construction, you would hope that the person would get a job in that area, but you would not expect them to be in a restaurant serving people, because why spend $40,000 a year to do that? It's not fair to the kids themselves, and they're very young. So these are all things that we are working on. It's not perfect, But the rhetoric of deportation that we're seeing to the south of us is somewhat alarming. It's their country. I've had discussions with the border czar that dealt with our southern border, which is their northern border. The U.S. Sends more asylum seekers to us than we send to them, even with last year included. I have shut down a number of the visas that people got in order that they were using to go to the U.S. by 89% since last June to December. So what we've done internally has worked. But if the U.S. wants to have a managed border with Canada, they're going to have to work with us. If they don't, we expect them to prevent asylum seekers to come up through the U.S. into Canada, because that affects my ability to manage the immigration system. And if they expect us to prevent people from going south, they have to work with us on, what is the safest border in the world? 400,000 people cross every day. So those irregular crossings need to end. And so there's work on both sides of the border, and regardless of our differences politically with what's going on in the U.S., we actually have to work together at that border.
Thank you, sir.
It's important to say this, and I don't think I can say it enough, that someone that is here and is not entitled to stay needs to go home, and that's the reality of things. The solution is not to give visas to absolutely everyone simply because they don't want to leave. This is what they agreed to do.
But they were promised, Minister.
They were made promises. I understand that people have made promises to them, and I think that is where the human aspect of this comes into play. What I've tried to do within my department is to make sure, because of the labor, because there is some skilled labor and people are qualified in a lot of fields where we need people, is to make sure that we focus a little more on domestic draws into our permanent residency pools. I've directed my department, I've directed provinces to focus more on the PNP draws internally instead of going abroad and bringing in even more folks where you have this talented pool here. That doesn't clear up the entirety of the situation that we see today. The expiration of postgraduate work permits is something that we are monitoring closely over the course of the next few years, and it's going to be a rough ride. Part of cleaning up this challenge that we see will mean that people's hopes will be dashed to some extent. But again, no one was guaranteed automatic permanent residency, and ideally we would have the bad actors pay for the promises that they falsely created. Someone has made money along this. It wasn't the federal government, other than indirectly through taxes. Universities, colleges have all made money. Provinces have made money. The books in Ontario have been balanced on the backs of international students. I'm not inventing this as a matter of political rhetoric. It's clearly been said in some of the budget analyses that have been provided with respect to the province of Ontario. That's a reality that I'm going to have to deal with the Ontario government and have an honest conversation about how we fix this. But it isn't up to the federal government to clean this up entirely, because we didn't create this in the first place. Probably should have been better oversight. That's water under the bridge. And again, the criticism is that I've leveled on myself, as I probably trusted these people too long. But it's something that has ended, and we'll continue to monitor. If the federal government has to take more measures with respect to these institutions, I know some are closing down, probably for the right reasons. It will. In a federal system like Canada, provinces have jurisdiction, but with that jurisdiction comes some responsibility that I feel hasn't been exercised appropriately. But I'm here to do it. Sadly, or hopefully, depending how you see my role, my job isn't just to stamp 500,000 visas a year. It looks at the entire ecosystem, looks at needs, looks at job creation, job loss. It looks at the intellectual capacity of Canada, the societal acceptance of bringing people into the country, and we adjust accordingly. Sometimes we get it right, and indeed I think on balance over the last 10 years we've gotten it right, and sometimes we don't get it. Just for clarification, there's a couple of things that I did, including recently removing the student direct stream, just because the reforms that I've made to the system that included addressing the issue that you've highlighted very eloquently, frankly, about fraud and verifying application letters and making sure that the institutions that are welcoming them, we are actually checking that these are true letters of verification. It was one of the first reforms that I made. So that has been able to catch a good chunk and clear instances of fraud. There was a statistic that came out a few months ago that clearly said we were able to catch clear instances of fraud, some of the most egregious, fake letters, et cetera. That wasn't being verified as well as it should be, and that's was a shortcoming in the system that allowed some people to come here and show up with this letter, mostly unwittingly, thinking that they were going to University X, whatever it was, and it allowed bad actors to thrive. I've currently given more powers to the College of Immigration Consultants to crack down on this. This is a recent regulatory change. Those are people within Canada that are regulated. It's a little more difficult to catch instances of fraud that are occurring outside the country. Indeed, there are reports that the government of India has cracked down on one particular instance of that, and so be it, they should. Illegality is illegality, we have to make sure that we are cracking down both internally and making sure that the conditions don't exist externally so that we don't catch it before people come here and are duped. The cases that came up under Minister Fraser were ones that were investigated to make sure that the students involved were not complicit, and those that weren't were allowed to stay. That is a process that is, I think, largely complete. But again, these were shortcomings in the system where we saw people exploiting vulnerabilities, and mostly vulnerabilities of kids that weren't aware of the process for the most part in coming here. And I believe that largely that is caught. But I think what I've learned in the last year and a half is that we have to remain vigilant, because there are always ways to work around the system. On instances of fairness, there's a number of sources for where that perception can arise, notably in, I would say, universities and colleges have been going to one or two source countries and constantly going back to the well on that. We expect a diversity of students. It doesn't mean that Indian students aren't some of the best and brightest. Indeed, one of the largest populations in the world, you would expect students to come from India. But what I've asked universities and colleges to do is you need to put a little more effort into the price of acquisition, to use probably an expression that isn't entirely fitting, but you have to be able to invest more in the talent that you're bringing here. And that includes going to more countries and expanding your resources. And that is a message that is ongoing as universities and colleges are asked to not only rebrand, but change their pitch to attract people from around the world from different countries. There will always be students from India, there will always be students from Pakistan. That fairness and balance isn't totally up to me, but it is one that I am watching closely, because there are students that are coming from those countries that could be really important to. Don't need to go to Parliament to remove the 50 points for the MIA. That's coming in the spring. So most require, I would say, because I have significant discretion, perhaps not as much as people think, a lot of the decisions that I take do not need me to go to Parliament. Sometimes it's important to check with legislators. Were I to do dramatic asylum reform in Canada, that would need to go to Parliament. I would say, unfortunately, I did try some asylum reform last June, and the Conservatives, the Bloc Québécois, and the NDP opposed it. So we are where we are now, despite some efforts that we've made. I plan to do more if I can, if Parliament comes back, but I wouldn't if you want to blame prorogation, you can look at the last 6 months and you can see the stalling that Pierre Poilievre has put into place. And frankly, he's been irresponsible on immigration, promising visas to everyone that he talks to, depending on what community he goes to. So that's highly irresponsible, or more flights to India, or whatever he seems to go around promising, depending on what radio station he goes on. I'm trying to be honest to people, and if they don't like the news that I have, then they can make the decision they want. But in order to be a politician that is responsible to Canadian people, you have to be honest to people, and I don't see that with Pierre Poilievre. Again, on asylum reform, if I need to do something dramatic, I will have to go in front of Parliament. But when it comes to the LMIA,